All right, all right, all right. I did a video last night and we were just talking about some Black history stuff. But tonight we're going to talk about police brutality and we're going to talk about the police and basically how they got started, which is Slave Patrol. But first, we're going to hear a little music, then we'll get into a little skit, and then I will play the video about Slave Patrol.
She gonna be. This what y'all been waiting on, man. This what the whole world been asking, man. Killer beat, you know what I'm saying? I told y'all like I shine, man.
You watching a big man?
Y'all know what it is, man. Man, I'm drunk as a skunk, got a blunt of that funk and I'm high as the sun. I be punkin' these punks, got the pump in the trunk and I ride with a gun. You better hide when I come. If I come, you ain't hiding. I'm holding this strap. I'ma shoot like a free throw and like a burrito. You know it's a rap. Put a hole in his back, ain't no holding me back. Cause I'm back on the block. Got some crack in my sock and I'm strapped with the Glock. Clap at the cops that they happen to stop. Pop up out of nowhere like Jack in the Box. Leave you as flat as the back of a watch. They can't get a jungle Mustafa. Who shot you? I know you remember what happened to Paul. Silver and boots in the pull off. Police, they want me to pull off. I ain't go to jail if I pull off. Why in the hell would I pull off? Silver and boots in the pull off. Police, they want me to pull off. I ain't go to jail if I pull off. Why in the hell would I pull off? Big felon with a list of weapons. A razor blade, a cake assist of weapons. Aiken, Nason, Gage, Smith, and Wesson. I spray and break your face in different sections. I'm from the jungle where them killers at. You don't want to rumble with a silverback. If I smack you with the silverback, I'ma crack up shit till your shit is cracked. I'ma snort a line, I'ma hit this crack. I pop a pill, then I light a squirt. They don't like a nigga like a Kurt. When I fight a nigga, I ain't fighting first. I creep up on you with this AR. Shots fired, man down. I was stressed out when I stepped out. Left was stressed out on the damn ground. This nigga is a damn clown. Might as well toss him in his service. No squares all up in my circle. I smoke squares while I'm sipping purple. And sneakers a renegade. You niggas just salty, you sweeter than lemonade. And when I get hungry, the streets is my dinner plate. Moving keys on the interstate. I got a sack with 100 grams, but I got to stack up 100 grand. Yeah, the prices are high, but they like to get high. It's a drought, I'ma tax them like Uncle Sam. Silver and boots in the pull off. Police, they want me to pull off. I ain't go to jail if I pull off. Why in the hell would I pull off? Silver and boots in the pull off. Police, they want me to pull off. I ain't go to jail if I pull off. Why in the hell would I pull off? Rolling hard in a stolen car. No license with some bad plates. When I got stopped, I did not stop. I was driving like I never had brakes. I'ma shake them like a fast break. I move left, then I moving right. I was rolling like a nigga shooting dice. When the stop signs running through the light. When I stop trying, I'ma lose my life. Clock 9 when I cruise at night. When I pop mine, I'ma shoot it twice. I said hot lines when I'm cool as ice. Hardcore with a dark soul, but I'm official like a barcode. If you a snitch, you get your jaw broke, nigga. You a bitch and you a poor hoe. My nose where the tar go. Spoon with a snort of power too. I go with that boy, I go with that girl. When I whip it, people call it child abuse. No peace for the police. And let them then on. I can never put your hands up, tell them don't shoot. You a black man, they gon' strike it out. Damn, I could have been Michael Brown. Police killing niggas every day. And they killing niggas that for trying to run. Look at Walter Scott, looking pretty great. And the system gotta be blind. Eyes open, but they can't see. Big G, Jeffrey selling cigarettes. I might as well smoke since I can't breathe. Silver and boots in the pull off. Police, they want me to pull off. I ain't go to jail if I pull off. Why in the hell would I pull off? Silver and boots in the pull off. Police, they want me to pull off. I ain't go to jail if I pull off. Why in the hell would I pull off? Pull off. Hey, what's up, y'all? Same on the rights.
All right. Now, let's find out how to not get your ass kicked by the police.
Community, myself, often worry that we might be a victim of police brutality. So, as a public service, the Chris Rock Show proudly presents this educational video.
1 second, let me check the sound real quick. All right, testing.
Now, let's
Good.
find out.
All right. Let's go.
Have you ever been face to face with a police officer and wondered, is he about to kick my ass? Well, wonder no more. If you follow these easy tips, you'll be fine. First, obey the law. Laws were made for a reason. Think of them as hints. You heard people say, man, I wouldn't do that shit if I was you. Well, here's some of that shit. Carjacking, armed robbery, arson, selling drugs, buying drugs, stabbing, shooting. You know, you probably won't get your ass kicked if you just use common sense.
Facts.
If you jump a subway turnstile, you might just get off with a warning from the police. But if you jump a turnstile carrying a loaded gun and smoking a joint, then maybe you need your ass kicked. We all know what happened to Rodney King. But Rodney wouldn't have got his ass kicked if he had just followed this simple tip. When you see flashing police lights in your mirror, stop immediately. Everybody knows, if the police have to come and get you, they're bringing an ass kicking with them. Here's a no-brainer. If you're listening to loud rap music, turn that shit off. Blasting fuck the police while you're getting pulled over by the police is just ignorant. When an officer approaches your car, be polite.
Is there a problem, officer?
And stay in your car with your hands on the wheel.
What the fuck do you want, officer?
Unless you want your ass kicked. Want to give a friend a ride? Not so fast. Your friend might be crazy. Now, before you let your friend in your car, ask him these questions. Do you have a gun? Do you have drugs? Do you have any warrants? And in case you do get pulled over by the cops,
License and registration, please.
remind your friend to do this one thing.
Shut the fuck up.
Don't give him shit. What the fuck you want? If your friend arrives, hit a white friend. A white friend can be the difference between a ticket and a bullet in the ass. Here's a tip you should never forget. If your woman is mad at you, leave her at home. Because a mad woman will say anything. He got weed! He got weed! If your woman is mad at you, there's nothing she'd like to see more than you getting your ass kicked. Now let's review. Obey the law. Use common sense. Stop immediately. Turn that shit off. Be polite. Shut the fuck up. Get a white friend. And last but not least, don't ride with a mad woman. If you follow these simple pointers, you probably won't get your ass kicked by the police.
Facts. All right, now let's get into how the police force was actually started. A little history for your ass. Let's go.
Slave patrols called patrollers, paddy-rollers, or paddy rollers by the slaves were organized groups of predominantly white men who monitored and enforced discipline upon black slaves in the antebellum U.S. southern states. The slave patrol's function was to police slaves, especially runaways and defiant slaves. They also formed river patrols to prevent escape by boat. Slave patrols were first established in South Carolina in 1704, and the idea spread throughout the colonies. Topic: Formation of slave patrols. Slave patrols first began in South Carolina in 1704 and spread throughout the 13 colonies, lasting well beyond the American Revolution. As the population of black slaves boomed, especially with the invention of the cotton gin, so did the fear of slave resistance and uprisings. Its development began when other means of slave control failed to instill slave control and obedience. Their biggest concern were slaves on the plantations, since that is where slave populations were highest. At first, incentives such as tobacco and money were offered to urge whites to be more vigilant in the capture of runaway slaves. When this approach failed, slave patrols were formally established. Laws were put into place to regulate the activities of both blacks and whites. Slaves who were encountered without passes were expected to be returned to their owners, as stated in the slave code. Punishment for runaway slaves could be expected. Black persons were subjected to questioning, searches, and other forms of harassment. Oftentimes, whippings and beatings for non-compliant and even compliant slaves could be expected. More than floggings and beatings, however, slaves feared the threat of being placed on the auction block and being separated from their families. If caught by patrols and returned to their masters, being placed on the auction block was an option for masters who no longer wanted to deal with their non-compliant slaves. During these times, slaves were often neglected and mistreated despite having permission to travel.
Okay, so what he's saying is, back in the day, before slavery was abolished, the slave catchers acted as what we have now as the police. Okay, hold on one second.
And to detect, encounter, and crush any organized slave meetings that might lead to revolt or rebellion. Topic: Slave codes and fugitive slave laws. The fugitive slave laws helped enforce the necessity for slave patrols to abide by the law. Although these laws were initially created to keep tensions low between the North and the South, it caused the physical formation of slave patrols. During the Civil War, the theory of contraband prevented the return of Southern slaves who reached Union-held territory. This helped limit the role of slave patrols catchers and changed the war. Another form of help for slaves was the Underground Railroad, which aided slaves in their escape to northern states. Outside of the Underground Railroad, enslaved black people went further south to ensure their freedom. Black people also formed their own organized networks and means of escape from slavery to Florida, where black people negotiated with Native Americans and the Spanish government, and were able to live self-determined and free lives. Formerly enslaved people formed their own towns, military, and merged with the Florida population as Seminoles. Formerly imprisoned Europeans, Irish immigrants, and other former institutionalized Europeans were immigrated through race-based policies to found the state of Georgia. They were partially recruited to form a buffer state to stop enslaved black people from escaping from the Carolinas, Georgia, and Virginia to Florida. Slave patrols in Georgia were formed for this purpose. Free black cities and armed and trained black militaries in Florida were a direct challenge to white dominance and profits in slave-owning states. The concept of self-determined freedom was also a direct challenge to the concept that whites should rule and to the institution of slavery. Slave patrols and plantation police were organized by whites as legal and extra-legal means to stop this from occurring. The use and physical formation of slave patrols came to its end in 1865 when the Civil War ended. This end, however, is linked to post-Civil War groups such as the Ku Klux Klan, which continued to terrorize and threaten the black community. In South Carolina, colonists began to write laws that constricted slaves long before slave patrols were alive and well. Laws implemented set in motion curfews for slaves, strengthening their militia, preventing slaves from bartering goods, and establishing the Charleston Town Watch. These are laws and ideas that molded what we know as slave codes.
Yep. And then we're gonna get to some Jim Crow. So, history repeats itself. So that's why it's important for you to know your history. Let's go.
Slave codes were different from state to state. Slave masters negotiated slave codes with their slaves. Topic: Patrollers' duties. Slave patrollers had their own characteristics, duties, and benefits, apart from slave owners and overseers. Patrollers were often equipped with guns and whips and would exert brutal and racially motivated control. At times, blacks developed many methods of challenging slave patrolling, occasionally fighting back violently. The American Civil War developed more opportunities for resistance against slave patrols and made it easier for enslaved people to escape. Slave patrol duties started as breaking up slave meetings. These slave meetings occurred on holidays, in which they would plan revolts and uprisings. Eventually, slave patrols expanded to be year-round, not just on holidays. Slowly, new duties and rights of patrollers became permitted, including apprehending runaways, monitoring the rigid pass requirements for blacks traversing the countryside, breaking up large gatherings and assemblies of blacks, visiting and searching slave quarters randomly, inflicting impromptu punishments, and as occasion arose, suppressing insurrections. Slave patrols consisted mostly of white citizens. Most people in slave patrols came from working and middle-class conditions. In some southern states, the militia and army served as slave patrols. In other southern states, slave patrols came about from colonial or state government legislation. Slave patrols typically rode on horseback in groups of 4 or 5, sometimes even in family groups. They often worked sun up to sundown and varied their times and locations of patrol to lower the chances of slaves escaping. They used no special equipment. Their chief tools, instead, were whips and intimidation. Some states, such as South Carolina, required every white man, under consequence of 40 shillings, to arrest and chastise any slave found away from their home without proper verification.
Wow. Wow.
After slaves were arrested and chastised, they were returned to their masters. In some instances, white men encouraged slaves to
You can write in the comment section or in the chat when the video over, in the comment section, answer this question. Do you think the police has changed at all from being slave patrols? Do you think that? I mean, it seems like it's the same thing going on. If you agree, you put something in the comment section with the video over.
escape for the sake of being rewarded after the slave had been caught and returned to their master. In some areas, killing a slave was not considered a crime by the courts or community.
What? Let me run that back. What? And I just got done asking the question. Do you think anything has changed? Listen to what he said. Listen.
For the sake of being rewarded after the slave had been caught and returned to their master. In some areas, killing a slave was not considered a crime by the courts or community.
That's crazy. That is crazy. See, that's why I said fuck the elite before I changed the title. Let's keep going.
Despite the difficulties of being a patroller, there were also benefits. For example, patrollers were exempt from public, county, and parish taxes and fees during their term of service. In addition, some patrollers were paid additional sums with surplus money. Also, regardless of the power patrollers held, they had limitations. For example, although whippings and beatings were permitted, a deterrent also existed. This was the fact that, if whipped or beaten too severely, the slave was then of no use to their masters as laborers the next day. As a consequence, overly brutal patrollers could expect revenge from slave owners.
Give me a second to ponder on that.
Diminishing use of...
Give me a second to ponder on that.
Topic: American Civil War. The Civil War lasted for 4 years and took place almost completely in southern slave states, directly threatening the very existence of slavery and, in turn, slave patrols. The first year after the Civil War began, slave patrols increased. Whites were expecting slave revolts, which inspired whites to appoint more patrols as fast as they could. As the war dragged on, more and more white men were being called upon to serve in the Confederate
you know what I
Army.
just thought about?
White.
You know what I just thought about? Man. There's a lot of so a lot of Caucasian, you know, they came from the Caucasus Mountains. We're not going to get into that. But they had children. Those children had children. And they're going to follow in their family's footsteps. So when we're looking at police brutality today, you got to think some of these police officers that are police now, they came from a long line of racist people. Their whole family racist, and then they the police, and then their grandfather the police. Shit ain't gonna stop, huh? Until we get more black police officers. But I've seen some black police officers, and they worse. They even worse than the white ones. Just saying.
Men who would have served in slave patrols had they remained in their communities went to serve in the Confederate Army. Some young men who were turned away by the Army, mostly for medical reasons, ended up taking places within the slave patrols. As slave owners entered the Confederate Army, some slaves lost the shield they once had to protect them from the harsh and brutal beatings. After the Emancipation Proclamation, the increasing number of white men being called to the militias of the South in 1862 and 1863 resulted in many slave patrols simply not having enough men to be as active as they once were. As the Union Army moved into local areas and communities, the likelihood of slaves that could flee to the areas controlled by the Union increased. Docile and obedient slaves started to disappear in the night, running toward the north to give themselves up to the Union Army.
All right. That's just crazy. All right, let me go back. All right. I might get strike for this, but whatever. All right, let's go here. Hold on. We're gonna take a look. Hold on 1 second. Oh, this shit is funny. Okay, now we're gonna take a look at well, we're gonna listen to what would happen if if white people had the cops called on them the way people do on black people. Okay, let's go. Let's just listen.
It was really good. Oh yeah, now he doesn't want to talk. Oh, now he doesn't want to talk, huh?
It's illegal. We're going to be playing frisbee without a lifeguard's permission.
No, it's not actually. I just looked at a map. It says you can totally play frisbee here.
Well, according to Los Angeles County, it is illegal for these two gentlemen to be here playing frisbee without a lifeguard's permission. It's a $100 fine. I looked it up on Google.
Why are you tripping so hard? It's just frisbee.
It costs our taxpayers money when kids get hit by frisbees and get hurt at the beach. Or what if that frisbee goes into the ocean and a whale eats it and that whale explodes and I get whale guts all over this hoodie and then I explode? You seen Free Willy? Not on my watch.
So you're saying that kids
In the video, it's a dude called the police with the white people. This shit funny.
can get hurt and the whale's gonna explode because of a plastic.
I'm saying that there's laws at this beach and they need to be followed. This is the law.
I don't know, man. You sound like you're tripping over a frisbee.
You know what? I'm not tripping over frisbee. And guess what? Guess what? I called the police, the fire department, the Coast Guard, the Marines, the Navy, the Armed Forces, and Steve Harvey and Kanye, and the last one was a choice.
So you're not just racially profiling these two dudes, man? They're literally doing nothing wrong.
No, I'm not racially profiling these two white gentlemen. You know why? Because I don't see color, okay? But they are a little bit menacing and threatening based on their race alone. They're making me a little uncomfy, I'm gonna be honest.
I don't know, man. Seems like a new Jim Bro around here. Every time white dudes are out here playing football or throwing a frisbee, it's like the cops be caught on.
I've been in prison on this beach my entire life. I know the rules. We're all within a designated area. Fire department came by earlier and was against the hurricane. How the big deal is?
The big deal is that they're making me feel uncomfortable, and this is America, and I just caught you guys slipping. That's what it is. It's about damn time.
What seems to be the problem?
Excuse me, sir. They're playing frisbee without your permission. Can you please take them to jail? And throw them under the jail, please. Thoughts and prayers.
Really? That's the emergency?
No frisbees are allowed at my beach.
Hold on, did you just say your beach?
Excuse me, sir. I'm just gonna need you to back up. Let me handle this.
Well, you have anything else to say for yourself?
Actually, yes, I do. This video isn't real, but for people of color out there that are subject to constant harassment simply for making people feel uncomfortable, this type of situation is far too common in America. In a nation where blacks make up only 13% of the population, but 47% of wrongful convictions. Imagine having the cops calling you for trying to take a nap, or meet at a Starbucks, or barbecue in the designated barbecue section of a park, or all the other ridiculous reasons and rationale used to target people of color. Here's the thing. When we waste law enforcement's precious time dealing with these non-issues, we take them away from dealing with real emergencies and reinforce negative stereotypes about people of color in this country. We all have biases towards things that are different than us, but until we all start being the change and embracing people from backgrounds different than ourselves, we will never truly be able to advance as a society. We're all in this together, and it's on all of us to coexist peacefully.
Facts. All right, y'all. That's my little video about police brutality. I hope you enjoyed it. Leave a comment in the comment section. Doses.